Welcome, everybody. Thanks very much for attending this panel, which I think is a really wonderful panel. We have some of the leading experts on Afghanistan. We're very fortunate to have them not only in the city of Pittsburgh, at the University of Pittsburgh, and spanning a variety of different areas, as we'll see. Before I begin, I do want to make sure that I thank Dr. Rabia Halou as well as Sandy Monteverde for all their hard work. Sandy is the Assistant Director of the Ridgway Center, and Rabia is the Executive Director at the Center for Governance and Markets. And they do all the hard work that is involved in trying to put together panels of this sort. And believe me, there's a lot of logistical work. So please join me in giving them a quick round of applause. Quick and very well deserved. So it's my distinct pleasure. I'm Haider Hamoudi. Sorry, I should introduce myself. I'm Haider Allah Hamoudi. I am the Vice Dean at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law and a Professor of Law at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, doing work mostly in the area of Islamic law. But I'm not going to talk today. I have the distinct honor of moderating this panel of experts. And so what I'm going to do is introduce each one of them very briefly. Hopefully you have their bios in front of you, but I do want to make sure that each one of them hit a few highlights. And then I'm going to allow each one will be speaking for about 5 to 7 minutes. Following that, there's a couple of questions and dialogue internal to the panel. And then after that, we will be opening it up for questions from the audience, which I very much welcome. Okay, so I will introduce all the speakers before we go in order, and we'll be proceeding this way. So to my immediate right is Jennifer Brick Murtazashvili. She is the founding director of the Center for Governance and Markets and the associate professor at GISPIA. Her research focuses on issues of self-governance, security, political economy, and public sector reform in the developing world. She's got a great book for those of you who haven't read it, and I have had the pleasure of doing so. Informal order in the state in Afghanistan, about not just formal order, but informal order. And it was published by the Cambridge University Press. It received the Best Book Award in Social Sciences by the Central Asian Studies Society. And it received honorable mention from the International Development section of the International Studies Association. She has another book forthcoming also from Cambridge, Land, the State and War, Property Institutions and Political Order in Afghanistan. So, Jennifer has worked for the USAID, the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit, the World Bank, and a number of other organizations, very, very deeply involved both in the field and in the ivory tower of academia, working on the specific issue of Afghanistan. Our second speaker is Idris Rahmani. He's an independent consultant on Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia. From 2005 to 2020, provided research and evaluation consultancies to a number of organizations, the leading international organizations that work in Afghanistan, the Asia Foundation, the World Bank, USAID, US Institute of Peace, and RAND. He was a founding director of AIR Consulting Company, which conducts market research, trade studies, and evaluations, survey research regarding public attitudes. And these are primarily done with, again, some of the leading organizations that do this kind of work, the Brookings Institute, the World Bank, UN Development Program, and USAID. There's a co-founding director of the Afghanistan Center for Research and Policy Studies, and has worked as a policy analyst at RAND in the past as well. Following Idris, we'll have Akram Omarov, who was a senior research fellow at the University of World Economy and Diplomacy. Previously, he worked as a senior research fellow at the Institute for Strategic and Regional Studies under the President of the Republic of Uzbekistan and an Academy of Public Administration under the President of the Republic. And he has a master's degree in international relations at the University of World Economy and Diplomacy. He has a monograph, Afghanistan and Regional Security of Central Asia, the beginning of the 21st century, that's published in Russian, and a book chapter, Donald Trump's Presidency and Implementation of OBOR in Central Asia. That was published in a Lexington Books in 2017 as well. And then to his right is Michael Kenny, a friend and a colleague. He is the chair in International Security Studies and Professional of International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh, also the director of the Ridgway Center, I should say. Michael teaches and conducts research on high-risk activism and political violence. His research has involved field work throughout the world. Most recently, he has been working, or most notably, at least to my mind, recently, he's worked with the United Kingdom, in the United Kingdom, on the, and he published a book from that, very highly regarded book, The Islamic State in Britain, Radicalization and Resilience in an Activist Network. It was a 2019 Best Book Award from the Political Network section of the American Political Science Association. Again, very highly recommend this book for those of you who are interested. His work is on terrorism, Islamic militancy, transnational organized crime, and it's appeared in some of the leading journals in the nation with respect dedicated to this topic: Journal of Conflict Resolution, Political Psychology, Terrorism, Political Violence, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism. As I say, these are the leading journals. And he is currently doing really interesting work on the oral history of the Al-Muhajirun, the Salafi Jihadi network that is based in London. And last and certainly not least, I very much identify, I'm always put at the end and get to do the law stuff. So this time it's James who gets to do the history stuff and is going to provide us a very rich historical perspective, I'm sure. James Pickett, Associate Professor in the Department of History here at Pitt. His research focuses on empire and Islam as entangled sources of authority, with particular attention to historical memory and state formation. His first monograph was published with the Cornell University Press just last year, Polymaths of Islam, Power and Networks of Knowledge in Central Asia. And it examines transregional networks of exchange among religious scholars in the Central Asian city-state of Bukhara. He has a second book project coming out, Seeing Like a Princely State, Protectorates in Central and South Asia at the Nexus of Early Court, and Modern Nation State. His PhD is from Princeton in 2015. I could actually talk a lot. There was a lot more information I could have provided. I tried to hit some highlights because I do really want the speakers, who are really leading authorities in their field, to speak rather than for you to keep hearing me drone on and on. So with that, I'm now going to shut up and let Jen take it away.
Thank you, Haider, really for such a gracious introduction. And thanks to all of you for coming out. This is a real honor for us to have this in-person event. This is a really important moment, I think, for many of us and for our community. And at the Center for Governance and Markets, we put community at the heart of just about everything that we do. And it's really wonderful to see so many of our students, our postdocs, our scholars. Our dean is here, Dean Slotterbeck, welcome. It's just wonderful to see so many people together again. But unfortunately, we're meeting under very bittersweet circumstances, and actually quite bitter circumstances, to be honest. The collapse of the Republic in Afghanistan in August of this past year was a shock that I think all of us felt throughout the world. We felt here in our community. It was an avoidable collapse. And the warning signs of the collapse are something that many of us have been screaming at the top of our lungs about for many, many years. When I first started going to Afghanistan more than 15 years ago, the United States had enormous support for its efforts. In rural areas and urban areas, there was enormous support for what the US was trying to do. It really surprised me. It changed my mind about a lot of things. I wasn't expecting to see the levels of support for the US intervention that I saw. But as the years wound on, support for the US effort deteriorated and waned. Violence and destruction paralyzed the countryside. Thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions of people were displaced. And in fact, at one point, hundreds of thousands of Afghans were marching into Europe, posing as Syrians, for the hopes that they might get resettled there as refugees. That's how bad the security situation had become inside of Afghanistan. So I know for many of us, we were tuning in to the news this summer, watching the collapse of the government with great horror, hearing the terrible stories of women activists who have had to flee their homes in search of something better, fearful that their freedoms wouldn't be preserved. And this is the end of a very long story. The United States has a lot to learn from the mistakes that it made. The international community has a lot of lessons to learn from mistakes that it's made. But I just want to say that here I'm very grateful for the support that we've had of an incredible community I want to take a minute to speak about this before I, finish my words about what happened and what went wrong. In those days and the beginning of August, I had received many calls for support from friends inside of Afghanistan asking how they could apply for asylum. Those requests were handed off. They became too hard for me to manage. We handed them off to our students at the Center for Governance and Markets. We quickly had 400 requests from Afghans for help applying for asylum to come to the United States. This was 2 weeks before the collapse of the Kabul government. The government collapsed. We received around 6,000 requests, and our ranks swelled to more than 100 volunteers. And I just want to thank some of our students who are here among us, faculty members. I just want to give them a round of applause for the hard work and the incredible efforts that they put in trying to help so many people evacuate Afghanistan. As the evacuation efforts came to an end, we realized that we had a longer-term mission here at the University of Pittsburgh, and that was to help resettle the incredible scholarly community that I had watched grown over the past 15 years. So we're embarking now on a policy project to bring the incredible community of Afghan scholars here to the University of Pittsburgh, to embark on an important project to historically preserve this important intellectual community. And I'm just delighted to welcome Dr. Omar Sadr from the American University of Kabul, who's just flown in from Afghanistan. He's here with us today, and he's our first scholar as part of this important project. Welcome, Dr. Sadr, to your new home. So this is an incredibly important moment for all of us, but a devastating one. The United States, over the past 20 years, conducted a war in Afghanistan. It was a just war. We understood why the United States was fighting. But the United States did not seem to have a very good understanding, no matter how many experts they brought in, no matter how much information they were able to acquire, of why they were fighting. Over the course of this conflict, I've lectured thousands of military officers who've come up to me and asked me, what is the purpose of our mission? It's a frightening question for an academic to be asked. It's not in our bailiwick to understand the purpose of a US mission. Soldiers are confused. Senior military officers are confused about the purpose of the mission. We can only imagine the results and the consequences. So over the past 20 years, the United States has supported a very strongly centralized authoritarian regime in Afghanistan. It was called democracy. But democracy in Afghanistan never trickled down really far outside of Kabul. People and communities never really had the right to self-determination. Rather, people's expectations about the future had changed so much after 2001. People had enormous support for the United States. People had enormous support for their new government, but they expected that things would change. They expected that things would be different. But instead, they were served the old government that they had seen from the past, authoritarian leaders in Kabul who take money from the outside world and never give people in their communities the right to select their leaders at the local level, the right to have a say in their policies, the right to have a voice in the future of their country. Yes, they elected presidents. Yes, they elected a very weak parliament, but they were never able to elect their mayors. They were never able to elect their school board members or their city councils. They were never able to have a voice in the local policies that mattered most to them. And in a country that is as decentralized and fragmented as Afghanistan, without the support of communities, the government was just built to fail.
All right, so very good questions. And I hope I can take a few minutes and from my experience, especially the 5 years that I worked with US government in Afghanistan, the first 5 years of US presence, from the day they arrived, I worked as a senior advisor for US Embassy and USAID, and my job was to coordinate major US efforts with President of Afghanistan. So some of the questions that Jennifer is posing, very valid question, and I could try to answer it from an Afghan perspective, who was working between the two governments. But then after 2005, I constantly work as a researcher on Afghanistan's security and economic development. And specifically 2010, I'm very much vocal on media, especially in Afghanistan. And I constantly warned since 2010, when President Obama decided to do this one surge and then take all the troops out, constantly warned Afghan policymakers that one morning you wake up and US is not here, just get ready. But for whatever reason, none of them believed it. Even 2 days before the collapse, based on very close assistance of President Ghani, he was thinking US is bluffing and US is not going to leave. That's why he never took anything serious. But let me now step back and say a few words about how Afghanistan came to this point before we talk about where it's going to go. My understanding is, based on how I'm reading history, and I gave you some reference for those of you who are students and researchers, just go and review the same references and make this judgment for yourself. I believe Afghanistan has always been a covert project for US government. It has always been a Secret Service, a CIA project. It has never been either a State Department or a Department of Defense project. And Steve Cole, most of you know, explains this very vividly from the day it started in around sometime 1980. So from that on, my claim is that this objectively formulated policy has never changed. Most of the things that Jennifer mentioned that Afghanistan did not go right in the beginning, I was part of some of those decisions. Constantly asked very, very senior American politicians, congressmen, and those who are very important in Afghanistan, that this decision we're making is wrong. Why not this way? And they constantly at that time told me, Idris, you should go and study. And I didn't understand that. But they were right. I didn't know international relations the way they understood it. It took me 10 more years to come here in the US, study, and understand what is the context in which Afghanistan is working in the global context. So my conclusion is that the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan in a very abrupt way was an objective policy decision. It's not a coincidence. It's not something that just happened. And I also believe that on Afghan part, lots of mistakes, but on American side, not lots of mistakes. Some of these are very well calculated decisions. And I tell you why it's it's in the interest of American government and American interest to do so. So I don't know how much time I have. I'm trying to be as quick as possible and as summarized as possible, but it's a lot of history to summarize in a few minutes. So the best way I can put it is that when American finished the Cold War operation with Afghans against Russians, they decided that, okay, let's leave Afghanistan. There were lots of other priorities in Iraq and also in Eastern Europe. They left. What Pakistan learned from that experience was that the US developed a factory called Jihad Factory. And there's actually a book about that, and you can read it. And due to short supply of labor for the jihad against the fight against Russians, Americans very quickly noticed, together with Saudis and Pakistanis, that Russian might stay in Afghanistan for a very long time. They never thought they were going to leave in 10 years. So they were thinking, how should we keep this war going on to make it costly for Russians? And soon they noticed that the casualty was pretty high and Russians were killing very seriously so they started a series of madrasas, which is schools for training jihadists. And by now, there are thousands and thousands of them in Pakistan. But by the time that US stopped funding to these madrasas, there were already more than 10,000 madrasas in Pakistan along the Afghanistan border. And their job was to supply labor to the war. In Taliban, all of them came from that, including Mujahideen and including some of the people who are now claiming to be ISIS-K. They all came from the same madrasas. When US stopped and it said, okay, we are done with Afghanistan, and Russia left, Pakistan started thinking this is the best time to use the same machine, war machine, and invade Central Asia. There was no Russia to defend it, and US left. And actually, Pakistanis thought they're very good quotes from prime ministers of Pakistan, from generals, that they were debating that the US left to give us a signal that Central Asia is a gift to you for cooperating with us during Cold War. And that's why they wanted to use Taliban, invade Central Asia, turn it into a large federation of Pakistan, according to their own words, with atomic bomb, but also this huge Islamic state that can counter India forever and also could become a major player in the world. US just right, so the only guy who was actually preventing this project was a commander in northern Afghanistan, Commander Masood. He was constantly fighting, and US was supporting him, along with Iran and Russia and India. But the day he's killed, 2 days after 9/11 happens, and US has no choice but to come to Afghanistan. There's one more reason that I think everything in Afghanistan is deliberate, not coincident, is that when US invaded Afghanistan, Taliban collapsed within less than a few weeks, actually even days. And as soon as Taliban collapsed, in Afghanistan, peace suddenly prevailed, and there was no need for more troops. At that time, Americans had a few green berets and everything happened. However, months later after that, US decided to bring 100,000 of soldiers. The very good question is why, and now the documents are declassified, you can go and review. It turns out that Pakistan still did not take the signal serious. They still wanted to push US back and invade Central Asia, and US really wanted to stop Pakistan. But anyway, since the time is short, I cannot explain this whole thing. I just want to summarize this, that by the time US, in 2010, US noticed that Russia is back forcefully, and there is no way that Pakistan can anymore deter Central Asia. So they already thought that the presence here is no more serving American interests, especially when Russians and Chinese and Iranians are not appreciating it, and even putting bounties for the Taliban to kill American soldiers. So since then, Americans constantly started to leave, but the way they left is very, very interesting in terms of learning how it's going to actually unfold in the next few months and few years. I'll stop here, but maybe later on, if during conversation you get a chance, I could explain where it might go. Actually, most of us who are engaged with Afghanistan will already know where it's going to go. But in case somebody was interested, we'll talk about it. All right.
Thank you. So I would like first, I think, considering my home country, Uzbekistan, I would like slightly bring kind of Central Asian perspective and how it was perceived, at least in my view, in the region, how the state collapsed in Afghanistan and what all the stuff which happened in August. I think we criticize Soviet Union a lot for what they have done in Afghanistan, but at least the way they make a withdrawal from the country was, I think, much more planned and organized than it was conducted by the US. The way this dramatic photos and videos from Kabul airport, I think, shocked everyone in the world who was able to see them. And also from the perspectives of the region, the Central Asia and other neighbors of Afghanistan were left without any kind of ongoing and continuous support from the guys who were there for 20 years, who created all this kind of mess. And now kind of there are no guarantees, very little security support, and now some criticism on Central Asian countries that they are dealing now with Taliban, that look, they're bad guys and you are dealing with them and establishing some kind of relations. But I think, of course, we don't like Taliban, and we are not very big fans of the ideology and their approach to this country, but we have to deal with the reality, what we can do. We can send troops to Afghanistan? I don't think so. We can just, the two choices, just to isolate Afghanistan, put more kind of soldiers on the border and securitize problem and try to keep it within its borders. And the second, kind of try to deal with them and try to find out what is possible, where are kind of borders or kind of restrictions in the possibilities to cooperate with them. I think the second choice was priority for the majority of Central Asian countries, despite Tajikistan. Tajikistan has slightly different approach, and they are more kind of very critical to the governance of Taliban. So this unexpectedness and this kind of lack of necessary support from the Western countries, from the US, from Europe, NATO, in these new circumstances, I think pushing Central Asian countries to more engagement, to more enhanced cooperation with, and especially in security area with Russia and with China. So I think the idea of having this balanced geopolitical relations with outside external kind of powerful actors is a bit tricky now. So the role of Russia and China is definitely increasing, not just in Central Asia, I think in all this region of Central, South Asia, and even in Middle East. So in terms of, and also we should consider the fact that in order to equip Afghan army, all countries brought all kinds of weapons to this country. So 500,000 just rifles and guns were delivered to this country, and their perspectives are not clear. Who are controlling them? What can we expect from this weaponry? So it's obvious that the first who are kind of in danger are the countries who have a direct neighborhood and borders with this country. Regarding the Taliban, its governance, I think now we are talking a lot about recognition. Should we recognize them or not? I think this is again something tricky. We at least United States already recognized them as an official political group in February 2020 when you signed with them a document, an official document which was clear that they are going to govern this country, at least to be in this government which it was planned to form at some point. So but now I think Taliban itself is in a quite difficult situation. It's it's substantially divided. There are many internal disagreements, and you can see this from the fact that, let's say, one group of Taliban was visiting Moscow and trying to persuade these countries, look, we are good guys, we are ready, we have changed from what we had in 1990s, we are ready to cooperate. At the same time, the other part of the group had meetings with former Taliban suicide bombers and expressed their support and willingness to give them some land and financial support. Again, this is demonstrating they are very strict in following their ideology. They're not going to change dramatically from what they had at the beginning. And finally, I think they're also facing the same problems which the former Afghan government had, like in organizing public institutions, and having kind of more or less kind of united position on many issues. They're declaring that they would provide some guaranteed security, but they're still incapable to do this. And again, this is raising questions about to what extent they are really ready to form government and to lead this country in the near perspective. And also about their independency, also there are many questions, especially the fact that how huge leverage is now Pakistan having in this country, how often their official guys are visiting Kabul and making the most important decision on how to form the government, whom should be included and what kind of external relations this Taliban is going to have. Thank you. I will stop at this point and I'm open for further discussion.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out today. Really appreciate it. It's good to see everyone. Want a second Hyder shout out to Robbie, hello, and Sandy Monteverde. Without you guys, we couldn't have done it. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. So I'm a student of terrorism, and so I'm going to direct my very brief remarks on the prospects for terrorism in Afghanistan. Just want to touch on a couple of different concerns, at least in the U.S. counterterrorism community, and a caveat that we've often, as we've been hearing, we've just often got Afghanistan so badly wrong before, and there's not a lot of evidence that we have learned from our lessons. Afghanistan has obviously suffered tremendously from political violence, both insurgency and terrorism in recent years. The Taliban were actually the main drivers of much of this violence. There are attacks, thousands of attacks against the Afghan government, security forces, coalition forces. And now that they've won and returned to power, we may actually see a reduction in insurgent and terrorist-related political violence within the country. That's not to whitewash the Taliban. It's not to say that they are not committing gross abuses of human rights and this unfolding humanitarian catastrophe. So I want to highlight three issues, okay? One regards the Taliban's relationship with Al-Qaeda and the prospects of the regrowth from the latter. There's a lot of concern in the US counterterrorism community about that. And to be sure, there are historical ties between Al-Qaeda, the Haqqani network, and the Taliban. For example, marriage ties that have developed over the years. It's important to remember that in recent years, Al-Qaeda Central has weakened tremendously and is now a skeleton of its former self. It lacks the strength and capability to pose an immediate terrorist threat to the US. And frankly, the Taliban has grown weary of Al-Qaeda and its ideology and see it as a threat to their cause, according to some analysts. But Al-Qaeda still exists in the country, as well as Pakistan, other places. And it's seen, Al-Qaeda is seen as the winner of the Taliban's return to power, at least in the US counterterrorism community. The fear now is that Al-Qaeda will somehow reconstitute itself and reemerge and grow to become a direct threat to the US. We don't know, frankly, we don't know what's going to happen. I do think it's important to remember that the Taliban at this point is eager for international recognition and acceptance and cooperation from the international community. I'd like to get access to the funds that have been frozen and international aid. I think the Taliban understand it's not likely to receive such support if it allows Al-Qaeda to plan and carry out attacks against the US and the West more broadly. The second issue I want to touch on is the Islamic State in Khorasan. Unlike Al-Qaeda, this is not an allied organization of the Taliban. They're actually a competitor, even an enemy, for a variety of theological, ideological, and strategic differences between the two groups. ISK, referring to its common acronym, has engaged in highly lethal attacks over the last 7 years. Yes, it's got fighters, especially in eastern Afghanistan, northern Afghanistan. And between 2015 and 2020, the Afghan Taliban and ISK clashed in at least 16 provinces throughout the country. The concern now is that a resilient and resurgent ISK will continue to carry out attacks like we saw at the Kabul airport on August 26, the suicide bombing of the Shiite mosque in northern Afghanistan in Kunduz province last month, and a number of other attacks. Yes, ISK is motivated to attack the United States, But in recent years, its capabilities have been degraded, in part due to attacks by the Taliban and the US and the coalition before we left. We should expect that ISK will continue to attack the Taliban in Afghanistan. That's probably certainly one of the bigger terrorist threats that the country faces in the near to intermediate future. Attacks from the ISK against the Taliban and against civilians. ISK will continue to portray the Taliban as the pawn of the international community that abandoned jihad and not a legitimate emirate. Meanwhile, the Taliban faces tremendous challenges to running the country, as some panelists have noted. And how much does that leave them to crack down against ISK? It's another thing we don't know. The Taliban is likely to continue to raid and roll up ISK cells in the next few months, but over the longer term, they may be looking at a protracted war between the Taliban and ISK. It's a possibility. The third issue I want to touch on very quickly, foreign fighters. The extent to which the Taliban and its restored Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, will this serve as an inspiration to people from the West to make hijrah and go over there, to immigrate to the country? Certainly, we see a lot of online chatter about this now, concerns that the Islamic Emirate will be, a magnet, a rallying cry for the larger jihadi movement. But again, it's really not clear. We remember that after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, the country became a magnet for foreign fighters, drawing by some estimates up to 20,000. What's less remembered is that during the Taliban's first period of rule from 1996 to 2001, the country did not emerge as a huge magnet for international foreign fighters, at least on the scale that we later saw in Iraq and Syria for ISIS. There's a number of reasons for this, but jihadis actually used to lament the lack of fighters and clerics who were willing to join the Taliban. And a lot of the chatter that we're seeing now is actually, there's a lot of enthusiasm for going to Afghanistan, but a lot of it is focused on ISK, not the Taliban. ISK has greater appeal for many Western jihadis. ISK is fighting for a pan-Islamic caliphate, which they see as a more legitimate objective than what is sometimes perceived as an emirate run by Deobandi Sufis. This is how they are, this is how the Taliban is sometimes portrayed. There are also logistical challenge of Western fighters traveling to Afghanistan. So we may see a small number of fighters, okay, but it's not necessarily going to be a flood. It may be more like a trickle than a flood. Other jihadis will try to support the Taliban or ISK in other ways, financing, propaganda, attacks in the West, lone actors using low-tech weapons. Can ISK replicate ISIS's virtual entrepreneur model? That's one question on people's minds right now. So let me just end by saying, just re-emphasizing what's been said and how badly we've gotten Afghanistan wrong before. And it certainly stands to reason that we may get it wrong again. So thank you.
Okay, well, first, let me echo the word of thanks to the organizers for putting together this really important conversation. For me personally, as a kind of historian interloper, it's a real honor to be on the same panel as these genuine Afghanistan policy experts. It may be that I do a bit after this, do a bit more listening than talking, since my idea of where things might go from here is largely based on the commentary of the other panelists sitting to my left. But I'll do my best to provide some historical context when it's relevant. So let me start in this, the next 5 minutes by talking about why it is that the sort of Islam promoted by the Taliban is neither traditional nor medieval. Those are two sort of claims you'll see in the media a lot. So my own research focuses on ulama, translated as Islamic scholars, and also madrasas, a word that you've heard here just a few moments ago, which is usually translated as Islamic colleges. And my work mostly focuses on Central Asia in the 19th and early 20th centuries, including what is now Afghanistan, especially northern Afghanistan. Now, the word for students in these madrasas in my own research was talib, plural Taliban, right? So the same word is used to refer to these students. Now, so for these reasons, because of the continuity in terminology, people often, when they read about my research, they often assume that my research deals with the origins of movements like the Taliban. After all, they're called the Taliban, like in the sources that I look at as well. Or I just said the word madrasas. I think I heard a definition of madrasas as jihadi training schools or something like that, which is, it's a much broader term than that, of course. But the fact that the same terminology connects, the pre-colonial period with what we're seeing now creates a false idea of continuity, which is really what I'm talking about this moment. So, okay, so in fact, to make a long story short, the modern Taliban would almost certainly have been mortal enemies of their pre-colonial predecessors in Central Asia. Contrary to stereotypes, the dominant flavor of Islam in Central Asia for the better part of a millennium, leading right up to the colonial period, was an eclectic synthesis of mysticism, science, poetry, occultism, and law. In pre-colonial Central Asia, one of the ulama or their students might attend a Sufi music performance, adjudicate a legal case, treat a sick patient with Islamic medicine, all in the same day. So this is very different from what I think the popular stereotype is. So why is this so? Given that if you look to the colonial period and earlier, if we're talking about madrasas and ulama and Taliban, all of the same terms that you see in the media today, why is it that it's so different in terms of what the actual substance was? So the modern Taliban trace a very different intellectual genealogy than the scholars that I focus on in the 19th century. So as many of you will already know, the term Taliban, again, just meaning students, refers specifically to students in the Deobandi madrasa system. So Deoband is a town in North India where a madrasa founded in 1867 under British rule sort of spawned a spin-off franchise. So the Deobandi madrasa's politics were anti-colonial, but its pedagogical methods were actually quite modern, particularly in the sense that the style of teaching and the sort of pedagogy was borrowing elements from the British model in a way that was very fundamentally different from the style of teaching that you see in their contemporaries and predecessors in the colonial and pre-colonial period. So in other words, the Deobandis in their madrasa system were combining modern teaching methodologies with much older Islamic texts, but also newer commentaries on those texts. So a lot of the texts they were reading are the same texts that some of the scholars I study are reading, but the way they would propagate them and think about them and commentate on them represented an evolution. Now, the most important innovation of the Deobandi school was that it operated on a franchise model. And this is fundamentally different from what you see in the madrasa system prior to that, which is to say pre-colonial madrasas had no corporate identity to speak of, meaning that it mattered quite a bit who you studied under, but it did not matter which madrasa you studied in terms of prestige or curriculum. So in other words, the critical question was not whether you studied at Pitt or Duquesne, but whether you studied under Dr. Rahmani or Dr. Umarov, for instance. Deoband, by contrast, was able to spread its methodologies and curriculum throughout South Asia and beyond, again, through this new and very modern style of teaching and dissemination. The Taliban emerged out of one of these Deobandi franchises in northwest Pakistan. Their flavor of Islam is therefore rooted very much in the history of South Asia. It's not an offshoot of Wahhabism or Salafism, although it shares certain characteristics with both of those Middle Eastern currents. Now, more to the point, and the point that sort of I can make this relate the most to what I know best, the Taliban view much of the accumulated Perso-Islamic tradition as blasphemous innovation. So these traditions were the consensus of the madrasa establishment up through the 19th century. So 1,000 years of consensus. So in a sense, the Taliban are precisely the opposite of medieval or traditional, It's the medieval tradition of their predecessors that they wish to destroy. So I'll just leave it at that for context.
Well, thank you very much to all our panelists. Well, first, let me sort of thank everybody and give them a round of applause. Please join me. Secondly, so I'll ask just a question or two to the panel, and then I think we'll have microphones available as well. I should let everybody know the panel is being recorded, and so yeah, I mean, obviously for the audience who wish to, and we welcome very much questions. And I did want to make the first question sort of a general one to the panel, and it related to an invitation from Idris to talk about, where do we go from here? It seems to me that informed in some ways by some of the context, the very valuable context that all of you were providing. And thank you, James, on that context, in that context for providing some very valuable historical information about the word madrasa. I would add actually the word talib and the word jihad also have completely different meanings in the history of Islamic law as a student of Islamic law than they seem to in this day and age, far broader. But the question really is in terms of where we go from here. Jen, when you started, you were sort of pointing out that soldiers didn't even know what the mission was. And I think part of the reason was because I don't think anybody knew what the mission was, because it seemed to shift based on a variety of different perspectives. And some of which I heard, on the panel, by which I mean it became a bit of a potpourri. Well, we're there to fight the terrorists. No, we're there to create democracy. We're there to create liberal democracy. We're there for the women. We're there for the, and it became a bit of a mix, and it became very, very hard to sort of figure out. And so like Michael, for example, listening to you, one could make an argument that if your only interest was sort of anti-terrorism, you can envision, I'm not saying your position, but if one's position was only anti-terrorism, one can envision engagement with the Taliban in the same way that you engage with Saudi Arabia. We don't care about women's rights at all, right? We don't care about human rights at all. I mean, we'll pretend to, but we don't. Just get control of the territory and don't let Al-Qaeda do any of this stuff. And we'll help you, in fact, against the Islamic State and sort of look the other way on all the rest of it. On the other hand, obviously, those of you who have been involved in international development and democracy promotion would have very different ideas. And I guess, is there a possibility, given the different interests, as we sort of think about ways to go forward from here, is there a possibility for the development of a more coherent American foreign policy and policy towards Afghanistan? Or are we going to end up with the same potpourri and, as a result, diffuse lack of mission entirely? And I think, I'd be interested in hearing from each of you from your own perspectives about that. Yeah.
So I think that we're seeing a de-Americanization of the region. So I don't think the United States has a significant interest in what's going on in Central Asia, Afghanistan. So thinking forward, though, in terms of where are things going to go, I don't think the picture is very bright. I think a lot of the countries in the region are really betting on the Taliban establishing order and control. For many of the countries, the Central Asian republics, especially, they looked at the chaos in northern Afghanistan under the United States, right? During the period of the US involvement in Afghanistan is inherently unstable. And so as insecurity swelled, there were Central Asian fighters that were going to northern Afghanistan, and these countries saw this as a threat. Where I think, so there's a bet that a lot of countries, Russia, the Central Asian republics, Iran even, they're having that the Taliban can emerge as sort of a Putin, right? They can establish order, they can countries can trade, okay, there won't be human rights, but at least there won't be the kind of chaos that we saw, and that's a bet. But what we were beginning to see, as sort of Michael pointed out, as the Islamic State, Khorasan is increasing in its role as a source of opposition to the Taliban. And what we were beginning to see is something very similar to what we saw in Iraq, where you saw former security forces, former intelligence forces, former Afghan national security forces join, they're disgruntled. And so the only form of opposition that exists right now is with ISK. And so this becomes sort of a lethal combination. As if you look at northern Afghanistan, the former areas controlled by the Northern Alliance, we've seen radicalization take place in parts of the north. And then there is no more northern opposition. As we saw Dostum, all of these characters, Atta, all of the famous sort of Northern Alliance commanders left. And so what is the source of opposition? If you're opposed to the Taliban, where are you going to go? There's this National Resistance Front that was based in Panjshir that is very, very weak, seems very disorganized under Ahmed Massoud. It doesn't have a lot of international support, and they don't really necessarily want to be seen as they want to be seen as indigenous rather than global. Well, this is where IS becomes the only source of legitimate resistance against the Taliban. And I think this should worry all of us, given the global mission of IS. I think it's worrying the neighboring states quite a lot. And this is why the Taliban seem a lot safer, a much safer bet, a more indigenous bet for many than the alternative. What is the alternative? And it's kind of amazing after all of this time that President Ashraf Ghani spent more time probably fighting the Northern Alliance commanders who could have saved him than he did fighting the Taliban. And I think that's a sad truth of what we saw over the past 20 years. So I think IS has enormous capabilities because people are disgruntled. It's not necessarily because of their mission. The mission becomes a convenient vehicle, as it does in any insurgency, for the rise of these insurgents. So the US doesn't have an answer to any of this. Sorry.
All right. Well, there's so much to talk about. I don't know. It's very, very big challenge to figure out which part is more helpful for the audience here. But let me just tell us a couple of points from here where we go. Like, first of all, I want to just add from my perspective, when Americans fought Russians through a jihadi group in Afghanistan, everybody thought this was a mistake. Everybody thought arming jihadists was not a good idea. But we know history now. By now, a lot of people believe it was a good policy. It served the purpose, and it really forced Russians out of Afghanistan, and then basically marked the Cold War, end of Cold War to some kind of scores for Americans. So the same thing is going on right now. Allowing Taliban to come back to power, a lot of people right now in Afghanistan believe that this was a serious mistake US did. They should not have negotiated with Taliban behind the back of the government that they installed. They have also should not have told, if you escape 2,500 soldiers in Afghanistan, it would not have been a kind of a little drop in the resources of Defense Department. And only 500 soldiers in Afghanistan could have kept the state in shape, and nobody can doubt that. Afghanistan had very powerful military, and President Biden constantly said we should not worry about it. He was right, but there's one tiny little detail that now nobody talks about it, but I'm sure at some point people need to talk about it. That the 2,500 soldiers of US, they were embedded in every unit that was fighting. Like 4 or 5 Americans were embedded in every unit, and they were the source of all support. Because of those Americans, the Air Force would help. Because of those Americans, logistics was going on. And because of those Americans, the morale was there, and Afghans were fighting because they thought it's a big fight and Americans are with us. Now, Americans also knew that this is the core of the fight. But when they decided to pull out, if they had the intention to pull out in a way that the state doesn't collapse and state apparatus, especially if the military stays intact, they should have at least done this in a kind of step-by-step way by pulling out maybe one individual, and after a while 2 or 3. They could do it since 2010, because this policy of embedding Americans in fighting units was President Obama's decision in 2010. So, and beyond that, those who followed the collapse, everybody noticed that. So actually, the best way of putting it is that Pittsburgh is right now hosting a lot of special forces of Afghanistan. Right now, they're coming to Pittsburgh. I heard 2 days ago, a huge unit of it just arrived. For most of you who are interested, go and interview him. I just spoke to them the other day. They say that the way, and these guys so excellent fighters that Taliban were not able to fight them in a group of 1,000 against 10. They were 100 times better fighters and equipped than Taliban. And Taliban were really afraid of them. So I asked one of them, why did you guys just stop fighting and run away? He said, well, the American who were embedded not only left, they told us, leave and don't worry about it, just leave. This is how this whole process went. So again, the question is, did American do it as part of a mistake? No, I believe that it's a calculated decision because there is a larger picture. And those of you who are students of international relations, you could easily understand it, that Russians, Chinese, and Iranian are not cooperating with the US, and they're trying to create a huge alliance, and US is really afraid of some kind of engagement in war that three countries come at once. Pulling out of Afghanistan creates an amazing opportunity for these guys to really fight each other about Afghanistan, because that's the one region that they have huge conflict of interest. And the two of them will definitely go to fight. Now, having Taliban, so US was pulling this Taliban in Pakistan. Basically, US was standing between Pakistan and Central Asia and Russia. Now US is out. So Pakistan is still trying to go towards Central Asia. That's why Tajikistan and Putin has brought so much forces on the border. And on top of that, ISIS case pushing towards Iran, another country that constantly wanted US out. And then ISIS-K coincidentally employs a lot of Uzbeks and Tajiks and Turks who are from the same ethnic group, the Uyghurs of China. So we already know where it's going to go, because if you have three elements in a country, any country, you will have jihad: poverty, religious education, and then supply of weapon. Any place you do it, jihad starts 2 days. It's very easy formula, makes up. So now Americans are not going to release funds for Afghanistan and not going to help. And poverty rose from very comfortable situation to the hunger that 2 days ago kids died in Afghanistan within a month. And then all these school educators and all the madrasas suddenly opened, and even from prison, everybody opened back to work. And then supply of weapon is something in that region that nobody should worry. Well, American also left all of their weapons, something that President Trump constantly blames this administration for why you do it. Why not to take all of them out? They left huge amount of weapon. So we already know all the elements that turn Afghanistan into a huge problem for China and Iran and Russia is right there. And my estimation is probably it's going to take maximum a year, not even a year. And you will see huge wars between all the elements that are in Afghanistan. Well, Russian will be forced to send troops, and Chinese will be forced to send troops. Iranian will definitely will be forced to send troops. And then once it happens, we have already seen this movie in Syria, and it's going to be a very different scenario. Again, too much details, but if anybody was interested, we can talk about more and about the exact data, how things are actually connecting with each other.
So I think we should talk more about coordination of efforts rather than having US foreign policy in Afghanistan, EU foreign policy in Afghanistan, Uzbek foreign policy in Afghanistan. We had the same approach 20 years. And I think still the fact that it happened, maybe it was calculated decision. Yeah, I agree that it seemed there were some deals behind the doors. Yeah, that it didn't happen just immediately. Everyone just left the battleground. It seemed there was a deal that they will leave and Taliban will take over. But still, I think the way how it happened, it's not in favor and in praise of the United States. Investing in the country trillions of dollars and then living and saying, now we will have a China and Iran and Russia having a war here and that's our kind of goal. I think it's still not very good outcome of putting so much money in this country. And in this regard, I think we need to stop this kind of a bit kind of consumptive approach to the countries which are around Afghanistan, not just look on them as this is a transit corridor, this is kind of supply chain. So they are the real countries with real people living in this part of the world, and they are dealing with Afghanistan on an everyday basis. So we need, why you now one asked Central Asian countries or Iran or China from the US perspective on what kind of strategy we should develop in order to respond to these challenges. What your neighbors think about this country, how you them see their future. You were willing to, and in Central Asia, the expectation and the support to US intervention to Afghanistan was so high after 9/11, because we always, at that period, we considered Afghanistan security threats, the source of threats, and we were very happy that someone is coming to solve this. But as soon as we saw that the people who came at initial, they solved it very quickly and in a very efficient way. But then we started to deal with this protracted conflict with unclear future. And the decision of Obama was really good. Leaving is a really good decision. But again, how it was done, Obama at least gave some, there were negotiations on some security guarantees to Central Asia or on other countries. There were discussion of transfer of some weapons, military support, military exchange. I don't, maybe there are some secret negotiations which are going now, but open space, we cannot see such the kind of relations and exchange now. So I think we are still lacking, even in the region, I'm talking Central Asia, but even Central Asia itself is divided, despite having this more enhanced regional cooperation. Again, as I mentioned, Tajikistan has completely different view now in comparison with other 4 countries of the region. And this is something we should negotiate. And the fact that Central Asia, being a neighbor of this country, again, also failed to have at least one meeting on the level of maybe not at least on the level of deputy foreign minister, at least, even if we cannot make something together, we should send, I think, some symbolic signal that we are ready to cooperate on a regional level and develop some regional response to this situation in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Really quickly comment once. Just quick comment. I believe that in international system, international foreign policy in general, it's my understanding there is no good or bad decision. It's always interest-based decision. It depends where you stand and from which direction you're looking at the decision. So when Americans make decisions, Chinese, Russians, Iranian, they all believe they're making good decisions. But I think the best way of putting it is that, so right now, if we debate it on behalf of people of Afghanistan, we can always say, oh, everything US did was really, really bad decision, because it basically US built a nation for 20 years and then suddenly overnight, give it to the Taliban. Or they abolished the Taliban system and then brought it back and installed it 20 years later. So Afghans are really, really frustrated. Most Afghans are saying that US played the same game with people of Afghanistan for the second time, because this happened also during 1990s, 1980s, that the system was there, it was abolished, Mujahideen came to power. And then when they left, basically they brought a system of, again, Western technocrats, but then same problem that the old system had, they had all kind of issues we cannot talk about. So I'm just saying that I think it makes more sense if we look at this development from the interest point of view of different nations and see that, at least to me, that helps you to predict the next step and where we go from here much more easily than trying to just be subjective and think about what is good and right, what is wrong or good.
I don't really have a lot to add. I feel like these guys have done a fantastic job. I agree with much of what's been said. I don't feel like I have much to add. And I want to be mindful of maybe getting some Q&A from the audience too.
Sure. No, I'm happy to do that. James, did you have anything you want to add? Yeah, why don't we get some Q&A? I welcome some questions from the audience. Right here, gentlemen.
Sorry, this is a more general question. Jen raised the question as to thousands of experts report into Afghanistan, and yet she said there is a basic misunderstanding. Now, this happened in French Indochina, it happened in Iraq, it happens in the Sudan, it happens in Africa. That is, in every instance where the United States becomes involved, something goes wrong. Now, the basic question is this. We look around this room, we have all sorts of young people who are studying international relations and regional studies. And they go into all of these important agencies and they work for the NSC and CIA and state, and nothing happens. That is, the policy is still made, it seems, by this sort of section at the very apex, which has nothing but slogans to take authoritarian regimes and call them democracies, and then craft policies, which from the very first are simply not going to work. So the question is, why does this happen? No, it's not.
I mean, I think there's a huge, this is a big question that's bigger than, we could have a whole seminar on this, last a semester, but look, this is an important question. I think it goes to the ability of, we should question security policy, development policy. The idea that we can engineer lots of these outcomes, the fact that we have such a hard time understanding incentives, that we look so narrowly at our own and think that we're doing things from the bottom up, but they're really from the top down. It's like we have different words to call things that are, I mean, it's really perplexing, but I think that the ability, I think that we have to ask the bigger question. It's not just the United States that has this problem, right? I think it's a lot of countries that are trying to impose, you know, various perspectives using military force on others. And now, one thing that I do want to bear in mind, though, is that within Afghanistan, there was enormous support. So we confuse the military with the normative. So inside of Afghanistan, there was enormous support for many things that the US was trying to do there. But the way the US did it undermined its entire effort, both from the security side and from the military side and the humanitarian side. The ability to implement, look, we don't have enough, but enough of our students, they study security policy, but they don't know how to manage things, right? Get things done, understand the incentive structure of how things work. And I think there's an inherent disconnect. So the ability of the United States and other countries to actually, the Soviets faced the same problem, right? The Soviets failed, and the Soviets failed time and time again. There's nobody here that knows this better than you. So the ability to impose these things from the outside without understanding the views of indigenous populations who get sort of wiped out in all of these kinds of processes. I think, you know, we call this development, we call this third world, we call this, I don't know what we call it, but the inability to give people a voice. And this isn't just something that we see through security policy. We see this on the development side. You know, this idea that we can engineer these kinds of outcomes, that everybody's going to sign up for the sustainable development goals. Right? This is something that's coming from the top rather than from the bottom. And there's still an inherent inability to understand these bottom-up processes that drive countries, because at the end of the day, it is the job of foreign policy, whether that's US foreign policy, Soviet foreign policy, Russian foreign policy, Uzbek foreign policy, to try to engineer outcomes. And that tension is inevitable. And that's why the kinds of failures that we see are inevitable.
Can I add? So I'll just add a little bit different perspective on that. And I give you a couple of anecdotes from very, very important people in the world. I believe that strategic ambiguity is the term that they use for what you're explaining, that why nobody knows what's going on. It's called strategic ambiguity, and now it's the modern way of dealing with global politics, because states are so powerful, and the traditional way of interaction is no more affordable, because it's a loss of everybody against everybody. So specifically about Afghanistan, I've asked this two presidents in Afghanistan, Karzai and Ashraf Ghani, and I've asked lots of warlords of Afghanistan who were major allies of US. Actually, most of them came and asked me this question because they thought, well, I studied in the US and I live here and I'm engaged with Afghanistan politics. Said, hey, why this is happening? So you can go and independently ask President Karzai. They said, if you talk to State Department, they're confused. Talk to military, they're a little bit good, but they're still confused. When you talk to CIA, they're pretty clear what's going on, what needs to happen, and they have the whole history in front of them. And then one more very simple policy issue. In Afghanistan, Jennifer, in the last 20 years, those of you who are in Afghanistan knows it, State Department had this policy of turnover every 6 months. Military had 1 to 2 years. And there was a station of CIA, nobody knew it, but those who knew it, it was not 2 years. They stay for long. If you go to a country, how can you learn it in 6 months, let alone making a decision? Everybody knew at the embassy. From day one, everybody said, please don't do it. President Karzai was begging, Mr. Ambassador, Mr. President. So General McChrystal is a good example. He went so fast and learned pretty much everything, and he tried to change. He tried to ask him to leave. It didn't work, so we know how he left Afghanistan. Every single general who tried to actually change the course of policy somehow was either forced or some incident happened, had to leave. The State Department, some ambassadors who were really, really smart, they knew this, but they were very, very experienced politicians or diplomats, and they knew that there is a big picture that they are not into that. So again, there's a famous quote from the King of Saudi saying that if you're a kingdom, you can have continuity in policy and you can handle international politics easily. But if you're in democracy, you're in trouble. You need to have another unit in the government to keep continuity. Because every 4 years, another gentleman comes and has no idea what's going on. In this way, you cannot compete in international relations with countries who have continuity. So if you're in Russia, you keep the same president for 20 years, 30 years. If you're in China, you can change law and turn it into a lifetime president. Or if you're Iran, there's a guy who stays for a lifetime. But if you're in the US, what do? You need to have some kind of mechanism that works. And my understanding is the way US is dealing with today's reality of world is that they try to keep most of this covered. And maybe 20 years, 30 years down the road, they declassify it, but that's too late. So to me, it seems like not understanding is not necessarily making mistake. Well, people make mistake, but mistakes happen at a level that is not necessarily very, very serious for the bigger picture. So people made a lot of mistakes in development, as Jennifer said. Yeah, development is a process that's full of mistakes. People made mistakes in terms of working with Afghan government or understanding certain personalities in Afghanistan. But my personal understanding, put yourself in the shoes of Ambassador Khalilzad, an Afghan-born politician, okay? And he rose to the highest level of politics in the US. Throughout 20 years, he was in between White House and Afghanistan. It's very hard for White House not to understand or anybody not to understand when you have somebody like him in the room. Not only continuities, I mean, he was in between White House since President Reagan. So I don't think most of it is a mistake, but it's just the nature of today's global politics that you have to always operate in a way that it's not your responsibility. You're not officially responsible for the outcome.
I just want a quick shout out to a very good book on this topic that was written by one of Tate Fagley, our postdoc at our center. He wrote, it's called After War. It's by Christopher Coyne, and he makes a very compelling argument that democracies are really bad at doing this kind of post-conflict reconstruction because they have short time horizons. And when you have short time horizons, you have exactly what Idris said. You have turnover, you have expectations, and the bottom line, the mechanism behind this is the lack of credible commitment. And so democracies are going to be terrible at this kind of thing for exactly these kinds of reasons.
Any other questions? Okay, well, let me ask a quick question, and I mean, this might involve some historical aspects too, James. And this was the Hazara Shia population. I think that's something that we haven't really spoken about. And I know most of your work has been with respect to Deobandis, but I'm sort of interested in sort of the history and the role of a Shia minority. Part of the reason was because of something you said earlier, Jen, which was, it's sort of like Iraq, where the disenchanted go underground. Of course, in Iraq, it was different in the sense that you have a big Shia majority, which sort of limited the power of the insurgency to, I mean, it wasn't going to be able to do the same things that one could imagine in Afghanistan. And of course, it sort of makes me wonder as to what role the Hazara have traditionally had within Afghanistan, and then what the future looks like, as it doesn't look very good. So.
I don't know if I am prepared to talk in detail about the Hazara in Afghanistan in particular, but I guess I could maybe say that I don't think the sectarian split, the Sunni sectarian split, the Sunni Shia sectarian split is necessarily like a Taliban specific issue. I mean, if you look at the 19th century and say the areas that I'm more familiar with. Most of the time, the Sunnis and the Shia live peacefully until they don't. When there's a political pretext or some other reason where the sort of discourse of that disagreement can be invoked to justify punctuated violence. I think it's sort of similar in a way to what we're saying now, but it's not necessarily particular to anything about the Taliban ideology.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Let me just sort of follow up really quickly. Sorry, just to clarify. Sometimes, because one of the things you had talked about was sort of a rejection of certain sort of longstanding traditions, and that sort of sounds a little bit Salafi, a little bit Wahhabi, and that there is some element of anti-Shiism that's associated with that, because of course the Shia, have a very rich tradition of post-prophetic. What would be called within let's just say the Salafis would be called innovations that would be heretical. And so at least some of that sort of austere puritanical, strip it all down to the time of the Prophet can at least come off, or at least has one of the manifestations of being rather virulently anti-Shia. And I wasn't sure if that was sort of an aspect of as well that's worth thinking about.
No, it's definitely something that comes to the forefront more in the parts of Deobandi Islam, parts of Wahhabi Islam, parts of Salafi Islam, which are different things. But I guess the reason I answered it that way is because that was also, so I was sort of drawing my remarks. I was drawing sort of a big contrast with a sort of Sufi sort of Persianate type ulama that I study. They also believe that. I mean, like that, like they also for instance, in Bukhara, slaves from Iran was a major source of military labor, and that was justified on the grounds that they're Shia, for instance, right? So it was not. So I guess the Taliban are focusing on these kinds of doctrines, but they're there to be activated in the larger corpus of texts that they're interacting with. Right.
And just to add to this. A book just came out that I wrote with the Ilya Murtazashvili called Land, the State, and War, and it's on property rights in political order in rural Afghanistan. And we look a lot at the Sunni Shia conflict over land. The Shia Hazaras are very marginalized, poor communities in Afghanistan. They've been historically victimized by the central government. And one of the things that we've seen over the past several weeks is the eviction of Hazaras from lands that they had claimed. And there's conflict between the Taliban and groups associated with the Taliban under the guise of nomads, and the Taliban are now evicting thousands of Shia Hazaras from lands that they've historically claimed, and they're backing up Sunnis who have legal titles from 100 years ago. So it's really and it's actually quite remarkable how quickly this has begun. But the Shia community is quite poor. They have some of the worst lands. They have been discriminated against, and they're much smaller, it's a much smaller force, probably 10-15% of the population. We don't have exact figures in Afghanistan compared to Iraq. Yeah.
Let me add really quickly on this. There's an interesting development with Hazaras, maybe help you guys see. So Hazaras in Afghanistan, yeah, Shias, ethnically they're Mongolians, but by religious, they're Shia. A very interesting development in the last 4 or 5 years about Hazaras is that they were hired in Afghanistan and sent to Syria by Iranian government to fight for them in Syria. And those fighters came back, and the Afghanistan generated a group called Fatimiyun. And they are very, very good fighters, fierce fighters. And they're still, actually, they started fighting the government, the last government of Afghanistan a couple of times. And with Iran kind of mediation, this was stopped. But however, after the collapse, Iran somehow reached an agreement with Taliban not to touch these guys. And they're also not fighting the Taliban. So, but this is a bomb right there, not blown up yet. I believe sooner or later they will start fighting Daesh or ISIS-K. I think if more attack on Shias happen, the first thing that Iran will do, instead of sending their own paramilitaries or this kind of fighters from other parts of the Middle East, I think the first group that they will use would be Fatimiyun. And I also want to add that today news came, I don't know how many of you have seen it, that former intelligence and special force commanders of Afghanistan who were highly trained by US, they started joining ISIS-K. The group just started doing this. And it's a big news for people in Washington. And they said two things. Said we had to join because US is not taking us out and Taliban want to kill us. On the other hand, our kids are dying of poverty, no food, and ISIS is offering up to $500 a month. So I believe that this is one point I would like everybody to take away from this talk. I think Taliban will be part of history pretty soon. They will be taken over by Daesh. If ISIS-K has the resources and Taliban are fighting with poverty and nobody in the world wants to recognize Taliban, nobody wants to give them money, they will be taken over by ISIS-K in a matter of months, because tens of thousands of Afghan forces, highly trained, they will follow the course in the next few weeks. This is the first thing that happened yesterday, and the news came today. This is going to happen, and there is an ethnic problem in Afghanistan that everybody the US supported in the last 20 years considered to be very much helping Pashtun government. And a lot of minority groups who went to Panjshir and they're under pressure, and US is not interested to support them, they might eventually be forced to join Daesh, because Daesh Khorasan has more non-Pashtun fighters than Pashtun. So we see a lot of reasons for Daesh to take over Afghanistan very swiftly.
Yeah, let's just make this the last question. And
This may get touched on somewhat, but in general, with all the educated people and all the technocrats and anybody that was like leading the country, does the Taliban have any ability to actually govern and services to people and, you know?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
It seems.
They actually
yeah.
mentioned, they actually just came up, their spokesperson said that I wish the transition of US was such that the former government was not collapsed. They just said, Taliban said, we don't know how to govern this country. And I personally heard from one of their senior leaders of Taliban who's actually running Kabul, who said to some of his friends, and they passed it on WhatsApp to me too, that they're talking during the night in one of the Taliban party. They're saying that we should be ready for packing up soon, because if this continues and nobody comes to our help, the whole nation will stand against us, and we will not be able to fight the whole nation. They're already packing up, actually.
I know I said I wasn't going to say anything about the modern stuff, but there is something interesting I noticed. Just like, again, I'm not an expert in, this time period, but if you look at like the Bolshevik Revolution or the Iranian Revolution, when you have a revolution and a lot of time revolutionaries face the basic problem that the experts aren't the same people as the loyal ideologues, right? So like, you need to run a state. What's a Bolshevik trash collector look like? What's a Taliban? There's no ideology for that. So you end up having, that's how the emergence of the dual state happens, where you have a guy sitting in the same office who's responsible for being loyal, and he makes sure the technocrat does what they are supposed to do. And there's been some reports of this kind of thing happening in Afghanistan, where like, that you have a Taliban guy there. And the article I'm thinking of was the New York Times thing about the mayor of Kabul, who's like still the same guy. You have a person making sure he's doing the right loyal thing, even so that they're at least getting some of the tech, using this strategy to sort of get some of the technocrats that are left over working for the state, at least as far as I've seen in the press. So I thought it was interesting.
Well, please join me in thanking the panel for a really wonderful series of presentations and answers. Normally, in the pre-COVID era, we would invite you to refreshments in the back.